Welcome, everyone. My name is Eric Marks. I'm on the MPSE Board of Directors. First, some MPSE announcements. The winter edition of our magazine, MPSE Wavelength, is on its way to members' mailboxes and is now online. There's lots of great content in this new issue, including my interview with Road to Perdition supervising sound editor Scott Hecker. You can find the full magazine at mpse.org. At the MPSE store, you'll find lots of apparel, as well as mugs, water bottles, stationery, tote bags, and more. That's mpse.org/store to see which clothes and accessories suit your style. And on the MPSE YouTube channel, you'll find lots of great sound advice events from the past few years. Head there to learn more about all sorts of things from the sound teams of Mr. Robot, Better Call Saul, Metal Gear Solid, Halo Infinite, Back to the Future, and more. And thank you for coming to tonight's very special MPSE Sound Advice event. Until as recently as 2012, independent games were commonly an afterthought for casual gamers and the industry's biggest game publishers. The PlayStation 3 was in its heyday at the time, and the public mostly assumed that indie games were simple, retro, arcadey games that you'd spend a few bucks on, download, and quickly move on from. But in 2012, that game company released a game called Journey that not only upended how we think about indie games, but about all games as a means of entertainment and storytelling. While a majority of big budget games are built around violence, addictive gameplay, cardboard thin plots, and dense fantasy universes, Journey proved that none of that is necessary to connect with audiences. The team at that game company stripped all of that back and completely eliminated violence from this uniquely quiet game. Journey was an incredibly personal, emotional, mostly solitary trek through a vast landscape to find a glowing mountaintop. The main character's interactions with the world were limited, nudging the player to simply move forward and find ways to traverse through each awe-inspiring environment. Journey is a rare game that possesses a deep well of emotion, a tangible soul that's only present in the highest of art forms. A key reason for this is the transcendent music created by composer Austin Wintory. Austin's music commands our attention, overwhelms our emotions, and inspires a sense of purpose to reconnect with our inner selves. Few pieces of entertainment connect with us at this deep of a level, but Austin did it on an indie game 10 years ago. Austin's work on Journey was recognized by the Grammys as the first ever game soundtrack to be nominated for a Grammy Award. Even 10 years later, Journey and its soundtrack cast a long shadow and have resonated with millions of players worldwide. Tonight, it's time to learn about what went into the music of this very special game. Without further ado, I'm incredibly honored to be joined by the composer of Journey, Austin Wintory. Austin, thanks so much for joining us.
That's a hell of a write-up, and it's worth giving the delicious backstory that I've known you just about longer than anyone else really in my whole career. I mean, we met at professional ground zero at USC, and I had the great privilege, but before Eric became a sound superstar, he was a filmmaker, and I scored films, and then we flipped the script, and in the years following, you edited all my YouTube videos.
Yeah, video edited.
Yep. And then here it's all come for full circle again. And this year you saved my ass on multiple projects. Stray Gods, the musical, you very helpfully lent us your studio for some of our wonderful cast, our as yet unannounced cast for that game. And also on Gundog, and I feel like I'm forgetting something else, but no, I love that there's a lot of history here. So it feels funny. It's very flattering. And I loved that description of the game. But I'm like, this is an old buddy. That felt so formal.
No, it's really pretty remarkable. We've been friends almost 15 years at this point. I mean, you as you said, composed my thesis film that I directed. We met, yeah, like very, very early in your career, and I'm so honored, you know, that we've known each other so long, worked on so many different kinds of things together. I actually want to back up and start the story around that time, even before we met, in the USC days. So sometime, I'm guessing around 2005, you were going to school at USC at the same time as Genova Chen of that game company. And you ultimately composed the music for Flow, one of their first games, which is still, by the way, one of my favorite soundtracks ever and of yours, and inspired me to want to meet you. So how did you first meet Genova, and how did things go early on in your working relationship?
So it's funny because I tell the story. I can't even begin to guess the number of times I told the story of how I've met Genova over the last few years, because every time, especially when I'm talking to a group of young composers, I recognize that I suspect the vast majority of folks here are closer to your end of it, music editorial or engineers or sound designers, who knows? I'd actually be very, very curious to know what folks do, but I've spoken to a lot of Berkeley or USC or NYU, et cetera, like composition classes over the years. And the thing that's sort of unusual about my career is that I can trace it to exactly one moment, whereas very often careers are kind of like this gradual rising tide. You don't have like the one thing that instantly kind of transforms it all. It's usually, oh, this kind of begets that, and then, oh, but I also met this other person over here and they eventually made a thing, and it just kind of gradually accrues as credits become slightly more noteworthy. And at some point, like when I think about colleagues of mine or other composer friends, it's like I become aware of them at some point, and then it's like, oh, that's a cool project. Oh, that's a little bit bigger of a project. Oh, that's a little bit. But in my case, it actually bottlenecks around one very specific conversation that is essentially the origin of everything, which was at USC. I'll do the short version. I'm not very good at succinct answers. So at USC, part of being a music major was having a requirement to be in some kind of performance ensemble. And I grew up as a pianist, but I never really focused on being a particularly good pianist because I was writing music pretty much immediately, just as a 10-year-old scratching away on the piano. And so very luckily, when I was in high school, the school orchestra kind of let me have free reign of the group pretty much every day for the whole 4 years I was there. So I put most of my energy from a performance standpoint into learning to conduct, and because I just had this unbelievably luxurious, talented school orchestra, basically eager to play music. So what that meant was that when it came time to USC, they wouldn't accept conduct. Like I couldn't join the orchestra as a guest conductor or something. And so it was like my options were piano, which I was like, this is a conservatory type education. The pianists here are real pianists. I'm not that level pianist. I could never possibly audition into one of the groups needed to satisfy this degree requirement. So that at that point, they tell me, well, you're not the first composer who has had this problem. So there is a men's choir, which is non-audition, i.e. it's a bunch of mostly composers and it's terrible. But if you sing in the choir for one semester, you will satisfy your degree requirement and that'll be that. And there was a counterpart women's choir that was the same story. And it was a lot of the people that were music majors, but not necessarily focusing on performance, like a violin major or something like that. So I joined the men's choir, and part of the setup of it was you had to give a concert one time during the semester. I think maybe two, like midway and at the end. And so they would pair us up, the men's choir and the women's choir, where the audience would be one, and then we'd flip halfway through. So you're basically performing for the other bad choir as the way to just check the box and go, yes, I was in a performance ensemble. I'm inching closer towards my degree. So we have our little concert, and it's like noon on a Tuesday. It was not exactly a prime time event. And I remember I'm coming off the stage, and the women are going up on stage to do their thing. And I see there's an actual audience member, a single solitary person who's not one of our choir members in the hall. And I thought, he must be lost. I don't know what he thinks is going on here, but this is not a thing you're supposed to go to. And so I went and sat next to him. I was the awkward guy who in a sea of empty seats, went and sat next to the one lone person because I
Wow.
needed to know who he was. The other thing was, I've built this up in my mind. I'm sure this isn't even true anymore, but as the years have gone on, I've like mythologized this moment where he also, he looked like, remember like the evil sergeant guy in Avatar? There's like quintessential G.I. Joe crew cut. And in my mind, that's what this guy looked like. He was all jack and he had the crew cut and he didn't look evil. He was actually incredibly friendly, but he had this, I think I've mythologized that because in talking to him, I realized he was an ROTC student who was literally going to go do like 7 years in the Marines after he got his master's degree. And so of course, why he was at the concert should have been obvious. He was dating one of the girls and trying his best to be a very supportive, good boyfriend. And so we just get to talking and kind of shooting the breeze. And he mentions, oh, I'm here studying game design. And I didn't know that was a thing because I had been interested in potentially pursuing a career in game design before because I was at this fork in the road in high school going, I really love video games. I really love game design. I was taking C++ and Java and HTML programming classes, but I also really love the music. And I was kind of like, I think I love the music more. So I ultimately let the programming and the design side go. Up to that point, my understanding of how to pursue a career in games was you go get a computer science degree and then you join as an engineer. And then, you know, you can maybe go to game design or whatever from there. I didn't know that there were actual degrees in game design or and as it turns out, this was the first ever year of it at USC, which I'm pretty sure was the first school to offer this, or certainly one of the first. So I had no clue it existed until this guy said, oh, I'm a game designer, I'm here. So I was super excited because I had been doing a bunch of student films like yours and your classmates. But I was, as someone who was a diehard gamer and passionate about games, I didn't even know student games was a concept. So I whip out my business card and give it to him. And you know how it is where you give out your card to people and you never hear from them most of the time. Well, this guy actually called me back a day or two later and said, hey, you want to work on my my student project? And he had basically reskinned Pac-Man into like a kind of militarized where you like lay mines and stuff. And but I remember it was my first true bit of game scoring. I wrote a single 2-minute loop. It was terrible. And but that was what got the ball rolling. And flash forward maybe 6 weeks later, maybe even less than that. I get a cold email from a classmate of his, Genova, who goes, I need a composer for my master's thesis. And Stephen recommended you. I just asked anyone in class know a composer. And Stephen recommended you. So can I show you my thing? And I'll never forget. He goes, I'm debating on calling it either Flow or Darwin's Island. Which I'm pretty sure if he'd called it Darwin's Island, nothing about my life would have happened. Because there's something about the elegant minimalism of every title of every project. Because his previous student game was called Cloud, which was very much in certain ways a prototype to their mobile game Sky. I mean, Sky's a million times more sophisticated, but Cloud was, if nothing else, similarly about flying around up in the sky. But it was very clear that I met him. I didn't know what to expect. I figured every game design student's ambition was to make the next Call of Duty. So I went in presuming that would be the case and that he's going to want some burly orchestral thing. And then he starts showing me his prototype of this Flash game. Him and Nick Clark, who was another student there, had made. And he was basically like, so here's the game. And I had never seen or even conceived of games being like this. And it was just one of those instant lightning bolt going, oh my God, this is like a whole other way to use this medium. And, I came from this very classically minded background. I was getting a classical music composition degree. I had, like I said, I was conducting the school orchestra and playing piano. And I was not one of those, buying synthesizers and drum machines and living in headphones type young musicians. I was much more acoustic and oriented towards kind of traditional. So when he starts showing me this and he's like, yeah, so I'm kind of thinking, all the sound should kind of be the music. Conceptually, I understood that, but nothing even remotely close to that had ever come into my life before. So it was this crash course, and I got to figure out how to do interactive music and electronic music all in one go. I did not know at all what I was doing. And so just literally dove in, and we made this little Flash prototype, and then it like went viral online before viral was a thing, like
Mhm.
because this was Facebook was just for college students. There was no
Mhm.
YouTube, there was no Twitter. So I don't even know how it must have like literally been email threads or something, how it got shared around. Because I remember
Wow.
Genova a couple weeks later going, we have 500,000 players. And it was like, where, how? And then a few months, and the PlayStation 2 was in its final year. And what we didn't know was that because the Xbox 360 had launched first and was like internet capable, which was new, it was a big deal.
Mhm.
And they had the Xbox Live Arcade. And so Sony was responding with the PlayStation Network to offer downloadable games, which was a completely mind-blowing concept. And they wanted to essentially create the iTunes store of video games. And their genius move was, rather than just basically making like a conduit for live ops kind of updates and patches to our games and that kind of stuff, we can also find like unique, weird, small games that are available for cheap. They're not, we don't have to deal with manufacturing boxes and games and getting them in Best Buy and GameStop and all that kind of stuff. And it doesn't even really matter if they're profitable, but because it will offer up as a value proposition to the PlayStation 3 and beyond, a place where you can go, oh yeah, I want to play God of War, or what was forthcoming like Uncharted and those kinds of games. The Last of Us obviously was not yet publicly known, but like those kinds of things were coming down the pipe. I mean, Last of Us I'm sure wasn't even at this point even remotely conceived of, but for sure God of War was already very much a full-fledged. I mean, God of War 3 came out not long after all this, so that was
Mhm.
already wild and rolling. And so it was like, we can make big blockbuster franchises and also offer up like weird different things. And they were looking for a developer to do that. And they just found Flow, and they reached out to Genova and Kelly and said, can we sign you to a 3-game deal exclusive to PlayStation, downloadable titles? And the first one we want to be Flow, as a remake that you kind of use the PlayStation 3's capabilities to the fullest and expand the amount of content. And then the next 2 are up to you.
Wow.
So it's like, obviously that led to them. They then subsequently made Flower, which was music by Vince DiMonte. And then the third one, which we started in 2009, was Journey. So it's crazy that all of that funnels to literally talking to that guy at that concert. If I hadn't done that, my life, I can't even begin to imagine what my life would be like. Cause like I was scoring indie features and stuff shortly out of school. And I met a few people independent of that relationship, like you, like, my neighbor up above me in my first apartment when I first came to LA was a guy who I think we're on our 7th feature or something right now. So like I would theoretically have some sort of a career. But Flow Flow was such a crazy, I remember I had to skip a week of classes to go to GDC because I hadn't graduated yet.
Oh,
And
wow.
I went up to GDC for the first time when Flow was coming out. And I remember looking at the schedule at all the talks, and it was just like, I was like foaming at the mouth. I thought, this is amazing. I couldn't believe, I didn't know anything about GDC, and I was so overwhelmed and thought it was the coolest thing ever. The Game Developers Conference, for anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about. And it's a
Mhm.
big, huge event in San Francisco that's practically the entire game industry together for a few days to give talks and prop each other up and network and whatever else. And so I remember the first day I went, and Flow was available. It was coming out like a week later, but they had a playable build of it in like Sony's booth on the Expo show floor. And so that was the first time I ever saw like strangers playing like interacting with anything I'd worked on before. And this was my first commercially released project. And I remember there was a talk about interactive music. And I thought, oh my God, I can finally go learn how the real people do it, because I bullshitted my way through Flow. And I remember I was a few minutes late to the talk because I underestimated how long it would take me to get there or something. And I go rushing into the Moscone West, and I come into that room. And as I came in, Flow was what was on screen in the person who was giving the talk. They were using Flow as an example of interactive music. I remember I
Wow.
had like a little point and click digital camera, you know, because this is like way before your phone would have that. And I remember digging it out because I was like, I gotta take a photo of this. It blew my mind that flow was being discussed because I thought, don't they know that I'm an idiot and don't have any clue what I'm doing, and definitely should not be like sort of scrutinized or studied in any way.
Wow.
So yeah, it really sort of got things going, but then obviously Journey, it was like one was lighting a match, the other was a nuclear bomb by comparison. I mean, just Journey changed my
Yeah.
life fundamentally in every, I mean, the fact that we're talking, like that's the premise of this conversation 10 years later, 10 and a half
Yeah.
years later. It's just never to be underestimated how much it wildly changed everything for me.
Yeah. So let's get into that. Like, it's kind of moving forward down the timeline. So Flow comes out, is a success. They make Flower, and then at some point, I imagine 5-6 years after you initially met and started working with Genova, Journey is the third game in that contract with Sony. You get brought on Journey. What are some of your early discussions like with Genova and his team before you begin writing music for the game?
It was like a fairy tale. I remember I went to Tracy Fullerton's house. She's like the godmother of that game company. You know, she was Kelly and Genova's teacher at USC, and she hosted. I think she hosted the launch party to all 3 games at her house.
Wow.
I can't actually have like no memory of a Flow launch party. Maybe we didn't know. Everyone was so young, we didn't know that was a thing you're allowed to do. But I honestly don't know. Maybe we did, but Flower for sure. They did a launch party at her house because I remember I went just as a supporter and as a friend. And I remember Genova pulling me aside and going, can we get dinner? I'd love to tell you kind of what I'm imagining for the next thing and see if you'd be interested in working on it. Because Genova is like one of these kinds of guys that he never has small talk. He'll never go, so how you been? What's been going on? How's life? He's like, hi, so here's the next like, it's just straight to it, maximum efficiency. And so I was super stoked to get together with him. So I remember we went and got together at a restaurant, and I didn't know him as well. I mean, obviously we'd worked together, but like I still expected the dinner was going to be like mostly catching up and hearing how he's feeling about Flower and all that. And then eventually we'd make our way to talking about whatever this new thing is going to be. And we sit down at dinner and he's like, okay, so have you ever read Joseph Campbell? What's your familiarity with the hero's journey? And it was like straight out of his mouth. And so I remember the thing that I'll never forget was he starts telling me about the game, and I realized this isn't a dinner, this is a meeting. And I'm like unprepared for like to take notes. And so I remember looking around trying to find something I could write with. And I went up to the hostess station at the front of the restaurant, and I was like, do you have like a pad of paper for some reason that I could have? And they go, yeah, no, not so much. Like, we have pens. And then in that moment, they like ran someone's credit card and it spit out the little credit card thing. And I remembered that, if you hold down the little eject button, it'll just give you lots and lots of blank. So I was like, can you give me like a huge scroll of 1-inch wide receipt paper that's blank? And so they did. And so I remember I took all these notes on this tiny little 1-inch thing, which hilariously, if you look at it, kind of looks like the scarf as a result. It's really funny. It's one of those weird little funny memories of the very beginning. And so that then led to a few days after that. He told me, it's the player is going to be in a desert. They're gonna be making their way towards like a horizon. They hadn't made it into a mountain yet, but it was like there's a goal, and the fundamental idea of the lonesomeness of the player as a prerequisite to the online connection then being this very emotional one. Genova kept saying, I want players to feel love, real love. And he goes, it doesn't need to be romantic love, but I want people to feel like this person came into my life and made my life better. Because he goes, all multiplayer is about competition or antagonism. And I want to see if we can figure out a way to explore a different emotion through multiplayer mechanics. So that was built in from the pitch. But the game Flower had literally been out for like a day. So none of this existed. There was nothing to show yet. he just wanted, Genova really, really likes to start with music. And so he wanted to explain this idea, and we would talk about it. And so he brought me down to that game company's office, which was inside the old Sony Santa Monica studio, right next to where Naughty Dog now is, and the whole water garden, you know, all that, by the freaking Santa Monica DMV. And so I remember going down there, and he explains in a little bit more detail. And then I remember at the time thinking, first off, I don't know how you're going to pull this off, because this sounds so creatively ambitious. I can't picture it, but I hope you can, because this sounds like my dream game. It was one of those crystallizing moments. I was 24, and I remember thinking, I've been a gamer my whole life, and I've played all the big blockbuster AAA action kind of games. I was always really big growing up on the point and click adventures. Like, I loved the Sierra adventure games, you know, like King's Quest, Police Quest, Space Quest, Leisure Suit Larry, and the LucasArts above all, you know, Monkey Island and Full Throttle, The Dig, Grim Fandango. But I played bits of everything. I was a huge Blizzard fan, you know. I had 20 million hours in StarCraft and Warcraft 3 and Warcraft 2, and so and it was one of those crystallizing moments where I realized all those games are great, but I'm really ready as a player to see what else games can do. And what he was describing sounded like the future, or I just thought, that's my dream. How do I have the great luck of being able to be part of this? Because this is just something I realized I needed in my life as a player. So he goes, what could be helpful, because they technically their deal with Sony was like a right of first refusal. So they had to create a pitch to get officially greenlit, even though the presumption was they would be greenlit, because obviously the first two games had like way overperformed relative to what was expected. And so, but they still had to go through this procedure. So he was like, we need, you know, we're going to be starting and getting things going in a very basic way. And it would be really helpful for the team and for me and for everybody if we could just have like a single piece of music, like a theme that just kind of is like the emotional thesis statement, you know, like a summarizing little just thing, and it'll help us kind of figure out the palette musically as well. Because Genova's whole thing is the games are always about the emotion. Most game designers say, ooh, I've thought of this great mechanic. You know, think of like other games around that time of that same so-called indie. I've always thought it's funny to think of Journey and Flower and Flow as indie games when they were fully not just paid for, but Sony owns that IP. Like, so it's like, I don't know if that counts as indie, but meanwhile, when they're working on God of War in the next room, it certainly felt indie. And so it's always been like this Rorschach test where if you're John Blow making Braid, Journey may as well be AAA, but if you're David Jaffe making God of War, Journey's definitely indie. So it's like this weird, whatever camp you're in, Journey was the other camp. Seemingly. So all that said, using Braid as an example of like a contemporary game, that's one. I'm just using it as a hypothetical. I don't actually know how John made that game from a philosophical standpoint, but the way most games would work is he goes, oh, okay, I've got this cool mechanic. What if you can freeze time and then like scrub backwards as a platforming mechanic? Cool. I'm going to make a game that explores what kind of puzzles tumble out of that idea, what kind of interesting story does that imply, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere at the tail end of that, you make your game and you go, ooh, this is what it feels like to play that. Genova is the exact flip. Genova goes, I want the player to feel X. What game would make that emotion? And so Journey, everything about the decisions across the board was, I want the player to feel really alone and desolate so that when they connect with someone, it's really emotional and powerful and primes them. And I want them to go through this very archetypal Joseph Campbell type experience together so that you really feel the trajectory in that, and that's like an intuitively very familiar character arc. And so these emotions were what he had in mind. What game gets there is almost of secondary importance. Well, as a result, he's like, if I have a piece of music that feels the way I want this to feel, then that can be helpful for the rest of the team to know if they're on the right track or not. So it's like concept art before concept art. And so he explains all this and explains the game, and says, you know, can you take a week or two and try to come up with some sort of a theme? And this is one of those unbelievably rare moments of just getting lucky where I literally walked to my car and I had it. I was still in the Santa Monica parking lot, and I called myself and left a voicemail going, okay, cello, ba 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 da da ba 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 da da, and then the bass flute comes in, and then there's going to be harp and strings, and I stepped it all, left myself voicemail, and drove up to Burbank, and I called Tina Guo, the cellist, and Amy Tatum, the flute player, and I said, can you meet me in like 2 hours? And I remember I wrote it out by hand for them because I didn't have a good way of, like, it was the fastest way to do it. And they came and recorded that day. And I did a mock-up of the harp and a mock-up of like the strings that come in at the end. And then I sent it that afternoon. And literally, if you listen to it later, much later, titled it Nascence, if you listen, it's literally the same recording of Tina and Amy from that day. We later, almost 3 years later, added the string orchestra and the harp and the other elements and did like a proper mix. But my little like $200 Rode NT2 mic and you remember that tiny little room across from the Warner lot of John Debney's building. Had them over there literally that day and never changed it, which was crazy because, you know, I had some fortunate opportunities with films and things around that time. And I had already spent a fair amount of time in the studio, but it still blew my mind that I could record a cello being accompanied by strings, but the strings were recorded 2.5 years later than the lead line. Like that concept struck me as insane. Now it's like, yeah, I mean, we do crazier stuff than that on a daily basis, but certainly it was very novel to me then, because it just intuitively thought, well, I'm going to have to re-record this. Like it's like presumably it will like atrophy somehow and the recording will degrade and it'll, you know, as if the tape stock is running out or something. Yeah, so anyway, that was literally day one, and Genova heard it and was like, yeah, this actually feels like Journey, I guess. So let's just keep going. And I remember Matt Nava he was the art director. He made a bunch of concept images and they put very light animation just to like show like moving sand and stuff. And they put that theme and Matt's presentation of like desert landscapes and stuff, and sent it to Sony, and the game got greenlit, and off we went in earnest. And it was 3 years later before it finally shipped.
Wow, that's unreal, and so amazing that you created that quickly. I did not know that story.
Yeah, it's one of those rare. I'm normally a big like elbow grease composer. Like I like to just vomit anything onto the page so that I've got a thing I can push around and move around. Like I remember as a kid reading an interview with John Williams where he talked about the 5 notes from Close Encounters. He said he tried something like 300 permutations of 5 notes before he landed on the ba-na-na-ba-ba, and feeling like, okay, that's the one. And that his theme writing process was always very much about like, okay, you know, da da da, no, that's not it. Maybe ba ba dum ba. Okay, that sounds promising. Like really meticulous, slow sort of craft through it. It's not about this mythical, you know, sitting by the brook and then getting struck by inspiration. You know, this was one of those rare moments where it just sort of popped into my head. I normally. And it's for sure the only thing in Journey that was like that. Every single other piece of music I sweat blood and tears for, particularly the ending stuff, all the climactic finale stuff was like, I don't know if I can do this level of rewriting. But it started in a way that was just oddly, it just somehow, I just didn't overthink it. You know, that's probably my problem is I typically just go, oh, it needs to do this and this and this and this. And then I have this laundry list of things before I've even written a note. But that was one where I just sang into my phone and that was that.
Unbelievable. Well, so you make that first sort of, you know, sketch theme that, you know, Genova needed. And then you said 3 years until, you know, the game ships, you're all done with your music. I'm curious from like a sound editor standpoint, you know, game audio is so different than film and TV, and music, I imagine, is too. So like that the game is being developed during that entire period of time. I'm curious how you went about temping the rest of music through the, you know, the entire rest of the game as that process is going. Like, Are you doing like many recording sessions with live orchestras during that time and replacing things, or like how do you temp it along the way?
So working with them is unusual, but yeah, I mean, it is a good kind of example of what's emblematically different about games from film and TV, because obviously the discrete chapters of pre-production, production, and post-production don't really, I mean, we do have often like labels that we give those things, but it's kind of like a combustion engine sort of traditional versus a electric motor, where you feel the gear shifts versus you don't. And that's very much how film feels, where, you know, you're going along and then, you know, pre-production, okay, now camera's rolling, sets are live, actors are on set. Like that's a very different thing from a screenwriter amorphously working on a script for maybe even years at a time, and then gathering up, you know, pre-production, you know, is one of those that like the beginning, how do you even define the beginning of pre-production unless you're talking about, okay, we're officially like location scouting or something. Whereas the other parts they're very discrete moments. Games, there will be milestones along the way. Usually it's about how like percentage completion we've made it through based on our initial spec of the game, which itself is already kind of a question mark, because games are like, you know, bundling up a bunch of airplane parts and throwing it off a cliff and then assembling the airplane, hoping that you'll have it up and running before you hit the bottom of the cliff. So there's a lot of just roll with it and see how it goes. You know, the analogy I like to use is, if it was more like filmmaking, to make making more like game design, you would have all your actors and your sets and your screenwriter all in the same place and just creating all the time simultaneously. And you're also inventing cameras. You don't go rent a Red or a whatever. You're like, okay, I need 30 screws and these like face plates, and I need to have like a lens tooled at this shop, and like now I have to assemble a camera. That's what games feel like. Everything is built from scratch. And so even with great tools that we have in the form of engines, you know, and like reusable assets and all that kind of stuff, or like stock animations that you customize or whatever, even then there's still so much that you're building from scratch. So so the result is there's it doesn't shove music to the end. There's no need to shove music to the end like there typically is on film, where you're in post-production 99% of the time. Composers brought in only after they've wrapped picture and they have some kind of assembly edit to start like throwing stuff up against. Now occasionally I'm brought in earlier than that, and I'm able to like write music for actors to listen to on set, or write music based on a script and that kind of stuff. But that's only if I have a long running relationship with a director where we're just in touch and friends, and they're sending me works in progress and stuff. Whereas in a game, most of my career, I've been brought in when the game is very little beyond spreadsheets, some concept images. And Journey was my first real taste of that. I mean, Flow certainly, but Flow was so different for so many reasons. Journey was at least like skeletally resembled a traditional game. It just was super unusual in its content and its philosophy, but like it's a third person, you know, go over here and do stuff kind of game. So the bones of it, it was fundamentally familiar. So being able to work on it throughout really let me iterate. So to answer your actual question, which you asked 50 minutes ago, and which I haven't actually addressed, is basically they knew the game was going to parse into actual levels, like in game terminology, like discrete sections that would get loaded into memory and then unloaded as soon as you leave them. And they would all try to be very seamless to the player, but there's like 8 actual kind of areas of the world. And so it was like, well, we're going to start with the first one. And it, actually, funny enough, originally there weren't. I think originally there were 4. And then at one point they were like, this one actually should be 2. And then there's, you know, oh, well, we really need something to bridge the gap between these. And it you know, as it goes, as happens rather, they find opportunities to make it better and to make it more kind of emotionally balanced. And Genova's really, really obsessed with like the smooth arcs of emotional trajectory. He doesn't like if you try to whip the player suddenly into feeling panicked, but you haven't earned it. The sort of, I mean, this is one of those things where the game program at USC was a subset of the film program. So Genova and Kelly and them, they were taking screenwriting classes and stuff, and they really learned a lot about narrative arc. It's very important to their way of thinking. And so so they would basically start and say, okay, here we're going to start with this opening area of the game. It's going to be a graveyard, and it's going to be very desolate, and the multiplayer won't even be possible in this opening area of the game. It's going to be just very minimalist, and the player will get their scarf and they'll learn the basic mechanics, you know, and it'll basically be like a sort of masked tutorial for the gameplay, and then that's it. Then they move on to the next area. And so Matt would start drawing, like, here's kind of how I can imagine this going, and you know, conceived of this idea that like the player might want to kind of drift down into a sort of bowl-like area that's almost acting like a sort of a hub, and clear that, like, ooh, that looks like a place I want to go. And they're very keen, because there's no dialogue or text or anything. It's always about like your eyes need to tell the story, and the environment needs to tell the story. And so I would just create a piece that just feels like, okay, I'm gonna just make like a simple 2 or 3 minute loop that's sort of like, we call them overtures. And it's going to be like an overture to the graveyard. And it's just meant to try to summarize this environment. And then when they start working on the next area, which we call the Barrens, which is the kind of sand waterfall area where you have to connect the segments of the bridge. Like, okay, I'll try to make like a Barrens overture. And then the next is what we just called the desert. It's like the open sandbox. And Genova had metaphors to all of these for sort of chapters of a human life. For example, the opening is birth. It's naive, it's clueless. It's also sort of helpless. You're in a big space, you don't really know, maybe it's a little scary. In contrast, the third area, the desert, which is now where you can really connect online to other people. And it's the first time you meet the little kind of creatures that will fly and they kind of play with you like dolphins or something. He goes, this is teenage years. This is, I don't have a care in the world. Everything is like, I'm invulnerable. I don't know anything of responsibility or the burdens of knowledge, or like, it's just, life is fun and carefree. That was the mandate there. So I would create these little overtures that are just simple little loops that they could listen to that would help inform them on how quickly you should be able to move through the environment, what the topography might be like. Genova really wanted the music to be kind of like the hierarchically sort of like master concept that everything tumbles out of. But of course, what would happen in practice, which was so awesome because I was there so early, is they would start designing and I would immediately realize, oh, I can make something way more interesting. Now that I see kind of where you're going, I can improve this. So I would go change the music and update it. And then they would hear the new version and that would give them ideas. So then they'd start continuing to refine the level design and the art direction and all the rest. And that would give me new ideas. So I'd make a new, and we just kind of were in this like eternal ping pong back and forth. And through the course of that, as the design, you know, over the span of months or years, the design would start to get pretty locked. I'd also be able to go, ooh, okay, so my simple little loop, I noticed when I came around the corner, it happened to flourish in a way that was really cool. And I want to make sure it does that every time. So then I start designing this interactive system so that the music is always extremely aware of where I am. And through the course of, you know, again, many months, took what was just a simple loop meant to capture the atmosphere and actually sculpted, you know, piece by piece by piece through every, you know, veritable grain of sand. I mean, the idea was the music needs to be so tightly matched to the gameplay that it feels like I'm somehow in the room with you, writing a personal score just for you in real time. That was the goal. And a lot of it was just trial and error. I had never attempted anything this ambitious on a dynamic music front. And I remember Sony was not using Wise at the time. They had developed their own proprietary music engine called Scream, which was full of problems. And we were constantly basically pushing the limits of what Scream could do. And huge credit to Sony, Monty Mudd, and Ted Coker in particular, as the guys that like really, like, we were joined at the hip, making sure that this music was behaving the right way. And of course, they were the only ones who had access to the actual, like, writing the scripts and things like that and the internal tools. So the way that we had to iterate was, I had a test kit in my studio in Burbank, and they would run off a nightly build every single day. And my ritual for years was come into the studio, get a pot of coffee going, and download the nightly build. I had to use like this FTP thing to sign in, download it as a zip file onto a thumb drive, then plug that thumb drive into my test kit, and then get the new nightly build, and then using like the debug commands, jump to whatever area of the game I had submitted music for the night before, play through it while I drink my coffee and see if it's implemented correctly, and then call Monty and say, so I think you have the transition on bar 7. I think it should probably be on bar 6 because I played it 20 times in a row and I noticed I was able to really awkwardly interrupt this violin melody, and I don't think we should do that, and blah, 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 blah. And so just literally this every day, more or less, for years throughout the whole game, just going as deep as we possibly could on every single moment. It's one of those, in hindsight, having worked on games that are just vastly larger in scope since then, the luxury of being able to, it's like having years to make a painting this big, where you just go down to the nanometer. I can be precise because I don't have this huge like surface area to deal with. Like if you're painting a mural on the side of a building, it's a little bit difficult to scrutinize. Now, of course, I try to have it both ways on every project because I got a taste of what it's like to have control over every tiny little detail on Journey, and it kind of ruined me for the rest of my career. So even on like Assassin's Creed or Pathless or these other games where the scope is just a million times larger, I'm like still trying to play test the game every single day and get in there with the team and really make sure like the behaviors, we're testing the behaviors and that it sounds like music, because this is where all this time doing film and just being a lover of cinema and someone who watched movies religiously growing up, and my heroes were people like Jerry Goldsmith and Bernard Herrmann and John Williams and James Horner, who understood the art of cinema, where you watch a film and the scene is sculpted where it'll rise and fall, and then we hit the climax, and then it beautifully will tail off, or you'll get a wonderful kind of crescendo leading into a real aggressive like crash cut into the montage or blah, blah, blah. You're dancing with the filmic elements. And the thing I was always irritated by, even as a player, as a kid, was that the music was very obviously attached to these sort of like agnostic systems that had no awareness of one another. Even simple things like on the main menu, I hit new game and it just cuts off whatever music is playing and dives into the game. I always hated that stuff. And I thought, movies don't do that. If I'm in a scene, if I'm watching a scene and then it transitions to a new scene, the music will beautifully and elegantly take me from one to the other. So why can't games do that? It's all code. Shouldn't that be doable? Like, it's not like we don't know it's going to happen. And so how do we make that work? And, it began my lifelong obsession with dynamic music and interactive systems. And also, I very quickly gained a lot of sympathy in realizing sometimes these systems are actually really complicated, and it's actually insanely hard to, one perfect example, in Journey, we had real hardware limitations on how much we could hold in memory at any given time. Even though the PS3 was like a burly machine, every PlayStation has completely blown all prior hardware out of the water when they come out. Like the PS5 is like HAL. It's just an unbelievable piece of hardware. PS3 felt like that at the time, but even still, there were real limitations of what was possible. And I remember one of the things was that we had to create these caches of sound that lived within a level. And as soon as the player left and it started to load, it had to pull all that stuff out of memory in order to load it in, which meant no matter how fast it went, it always was going to cut off the music where it was. And so, and it was driving me crazy because I was like, I hate hearing those like digital blackouts where it's going along and then it just, even if it's a fraction of a second long, I'll never not hear it. And I remember getting together with like John Edwards, the engineer at that game company, and the Sony folks. And at some point, I don't remember if this was a thing they knew in advance and I only became aware of later, but at some point it became clear that we can actually create a kind of like floating cache that exists outside of the levels and is permanently loaded. But we have to be very selective about what's in there, because obviously we can't put the whole game there and pretend to just eliminate all load screens. So we have to we can put a few things in there that we pull at the exact moment we need them. So when you play the game, every piece of music that plays when you reach the end of a level is actually not part of that level's bank of sounds. They're part of this floating ninth bank, so that as the load screen happens, you have this wonderful reverb tail that takes you over, and then the first cue starts and it's never interrupted. That was one of those things where it was slightly hacky, but it was like, finally, like the load screen thing, it always drove me nuts. And it was a solution that, and I didn't have the technical wherewithal to know that that was possible. But once they made me aware of it, I was like, oh, well then, I've got 7 cues that need to live there, and the rest can all live within a given levels bank that gets unloaded as soon as we move on. But that one needs to stay there, so that we don't have this stupid silencing of the music problem. And it was also helpful for the sound. Like Steve Johnson would create wind ambiances and things that would crossfade elegantly and take us so that it never felt like the game stopped. And it was remarkably hard. At least I remember it. I remember them being frustrated. Obviously, I just had to write the music, so I say it was hard as if I had to suffer. The TGC were the brilliant people who had to figure all this stuff out. But I remember they were very, helpful, because it was driving me crazy from a music creative standpoint. And but in the end, it's pretty smooth now.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit more about music editorial and interactivity. So you
I
mentioned
didn't even
these
answer
sort
your
of.
question about the recording process along the way. Just the real quick answer to that, by the way, was that I made mock-ups throughout. There was never temp music. I would create new music and then replace it. But the one exception was Tina Guo, the cellist. I constantly had her come over so that they never had to listen to a bad MIDI cello, because I just thought it's too expressive and vulnerable of a sound. So there would be mock-up everything else except the cello, and she would just come every couple months. I just get her a stack of cues. And the one funny trivia associated with that was that she booked a job on tour across the world with Cirque du Soleil. And so I would have these 1-day windows where she would come into town to do laundry. And I could get her for a couple hours. And I remember it almost bit me in the ass at the very end of the game, because I rewrote the very last cue where the players walking into the light. It's just this super high lone solo cello, and that's not the original ending. It was a thing that we came up with at the very 11th hour, and I rewrote it. Originally, it was big and lush, and it was supposed to be very kind of epic and dramatic. And then we realized this is lame. It's not working. We're overselling the poignancy of it. And so I tried narrowing it down to 0, basically, and tapering down. And she was gone, and I was like, I can't get a different cellist for this crucial last one. But remember, she came into town for literally 6 hours, and I just begged and pleaded, and she came over and recorded, because I said, I'm only going to need you for probably 10 minutes, because she's super fast and talented and brilliant. But it was so all important to get that one. I remember being so stressed. And she had injured her neck, and it made playing very painful. It's actually, my father had looked at her x-rays and stuff. He was an orthopedic surgeon, and she literally, because she's headbanging playing electric cello on this Cirque show night after night after night after night, she fucked up her neck to the point that she thought she might have ended her career. It was pretty scary. And I was like, all is hanging in the balance. And but anyway, yeah, so I'm sorry, so music editorial.
No. Yeah. So you mentioned creating these suites after, there was the first cue you made early in the game development, and then you started making suites kind of per level as you kind of, and we're working through them, adding to them, updating them as you went. In terms of editorial interactivity, and you're seeing these levels develop, and how long certain sections of levels are, how your music is playing. Are you mostly as the process went along, were you creating a lot of beds and sweeteners, or how did you sort of make the interactivity work in terms of the files you're delivering?
It's so hard to generalize, because every single cue became its own story. It was it was, for example, mentioning the idea of beds, some of the more complicated interactivity is in that open third area, the sort of sandboxy open desert, very playful space, because that's one of the few areas that you can play pretty non-linearly. Like there's a bunch of triggers for the musical progression in the world, but you can easily not only skip them, you can even not know they're there because it's a pretty wide open desert. Now, we gently guide the player on kind of a critical path, but there's nothing forcing them. So I had to develop all these contingencies of like, well, if there's sort of 4 landmarks and we theoretically want the player to hit them in succession, if the player skips to 3, what do we do? Do we trigger number 2 at number 3? Do we go straight to number 3? And I had to develop a whole roadmap because I was hell bent on it feeling like, again, how would it look in a film? You tell a story, you need a musical progression, but you also don't want to make the player feel like they're ever doing anything wrong. The whole point of player agency is they need to be able to do what they want. That's the joy of it. That's what makes games games. So for me, cinema is only the model in terms of the elegance, but it's like, okay, this needs to be all about the systems and embrace the idea of game scoring really does mean something different. So in the case of that one, the music, well, and also another aspect of it is because it's easy to get turned around and lost. We didn't want it to feel punishing to the player. And classic video game music 101 is I don't know where to go and the music is looping and I start to hate it because I'm hearing the same piece over and over again and I'm starting to associate it with my frustration of not knowing where I'm going. And now I hate this music because I'm mad at myself. That's like a classic thing composers have to worry about. So I developed the music where you have this top level like melodic material and then counter melody secondary melodic material and then kind of like rhythmic, like the backing track kind of, you think of like the rhythm section of a band. It's not those kinds of instruments, but conceptually sort of similar. And then there's another layer of that sort of like pure percussion. And then another layer below that, that's like a glue of subtle, quiet sort of ambiances and pads and stuff. And the way that it works, again, each cue is different, but the closest I can do to generalization is you'll get the big, strong melodic statement. Like if you listen to the soundtrack album, where a lot of what I'm talking about happens is in the track called Threshold, where it starts off and you have this flute going, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum, but it's a little bit of a waltz figure. Well, that doesn't loop. That just plays once. It's the topmost thing, and it's the thing that you can make a more pronounced statement if it's something that we're not going to beat to death. So then that goes away. Now, there's a whole thing about whether or not you're connected to another player, and because the online multiplayer aspect changes the mix of the music and add instruments that are only audible if you're connected. But I'll set all that aside because that adds a whole other dimension of complexity to this. But long and short of it, if I just wander around forever and don't go to one of these landmarks that will trigger the music to kind of keep moving forward, the music does a kind of auto decay where eventually all we're left with is that pad of ambience in bed. So that if I'm just wandering around, it's like a slow crossfade from the Austin show to the Steve Johnson show, where we want music to be very front, like we always called music the narrator. So we want music to be front and center in helping to guide the emotional landscape. But if the player really just wants to wander around, or if they're like trying to platinum the game and look for all the little glyphs, or they're just lost or whatever, or they see another player and they're chasing them around, and the music should very organically give way to just the natural environmental sounds. And so this is, again, process of trial and error. It wasn't ever done as a matter of, here's my stems, now let's just editorially see what we have. That is definitely a valid way of scoring games, and especially when you're working on a game like a gargantuan production, like an Assassin's Creed, or like Sony on the recent God of War, or even Naughty Dog. Like I did a podcast with Gustavo Santaolalla talking about The Last of Us, where he would basically just create heaps of material because, I mean, obviously, first off, games are not really his specialty, but second, it's also, there's just so much to manage that they handle the process very differently, where they will find ways editorially, per your question, to bridge gaps between sections and things, like using the guts of what he sent over. Journey was really not done that way. Journey was, like if I have the music auto decay down all the way to nothing, what if the last layer left behind is like a simple synth pad with a lot of silence baked into it that does loop quite a lot. Actually, I think if you stick around truly long enough, even that goes away and it truly loses all music. But it takes quite a lot. You basically have to set the controller down and just walk away for a while for that to happen. But the silences baked into that ambience track also make it where it's like it just kind of drifts in and then out, and you hear your footsteps and you hear the sound of the wind and maybe the creatures or another player calling to you, which, as a side note, that's a whole other thing, by the way, is designing that player communication system. That was a thing Steve and I did together, because that had to be a thing that interacted with the score, because you're going to be hearing these pitches constantly, and every area of the game is in a different key. And so we had a whole lot of shit to work out there. But again, setting that aside, each one of these was designed bespoke individually. It was not, oh, I pulled this ambience from this one cue and I found it could work really well here. It was like, I'm going to do this. And I would make drawings where I was drawing the map of the world and saying, this is the radius in which this cue can be triggered. And here's the Venn diagram of where the two cues overlap each other, all that kind of thing. And everything was very specifically designed, by me, and then implemented collaboratively with like Monty and Ted at Sony and Steve, and a lot of iteration, trial and error, and obviously play testers, trying things out, and you realize, oh man, well, this music, I thought they would spend more time in this area, and we're never hearing half this cue, so I should just cut half this cue, because I wrote this long thing and they always just booklet through this area time and again, so like reacting to the actual just kind of lived realities of the players as well.
You also mentioned a few the names of a few engineers at Sony, and then at one at that game company. Are you typically you also mentioned like the nightly builds and everything and your music being implemented. Were these engineers typically the people taking your cues and implementing them into the game engine, or were you implementing them, like your cues yourself, into the game engine?
Yeah, I didn't have any way. I basically could only just send them the cues, because the tools were different than they are, like with these kind of hubs like Perforce or GitHub or things like that, where you can kind of coordinate people remotely. I don't even know if those tools existed, but if they did, I was the only one off site, because that game company all had an office together, and Steve had his office in Sony Santa Monica. So I know he was able to, they must have somehow been networked to him, but basically everything was on site at TGC. So I would upload files, and then the Sony folks principally would be the ones implementing them, but we would have weekly and sometimes daily calls. And I also went down to TGC once a week or every 2 weeks for their stand-ups, the whole 3 years of production.
Wow.
So, I was constantly down in their office talking, go visit Matt Nava at his desk, see what he's working on, what's coming next, how I can be of help, sit in on the meetings to see how everyone's feeling about things. And everyone they were pretty flat structure. Like if you play the game and watch the credits, you'll notice no one has any titles. Like Genova, everybody just listed alphabetically. So didn't matter if you were junior designer, new to the company, or Kelly or Genova co-founders, everybody would give feedback to everybody else on everything, including to me on the music. And so I would go down there, we'd have those conversations. But yeah, in terms of the literal implementation, I didn't have there was no way for me to do that from my place in Burbank. And I wasn't going to go move my rig down to TGC, because obviously I was also like scoring films and other things at the same time. I had the rest of my career as a freelancer going on. And so, yeah, I would send files, and we created like very elaborate spreadsheets where everything was detailed. And I would, very often do things like I would take a screenshot in my DAW where you could see the bars and beats, and I would go, this cue should never trigger like in these regions. It should only, like if we're in a loop, it should do this, and like try to make it very visually clear. Then they'd implement it, then I'd test it to see if it was correct. And occasionally they would also go, hey, we found a solution we actually think is better than yours. How do you like this? And I would try it and go, oh yeah, actually good call. Like I never want to pretend like I was this sole little wizard or something. It was super collaborative, and Monty and Steve and Ted and Keith, our music producer, Keith Leary at Sony, were very hands-on and supportive, and everybody was working together very tightly, and it was always kind of like the best idea wins.
That's amazing. And as you're like, just from journey on in terms of music editorial, like what is your typical, like, I guess I'm curious of your post-production music team for games. Like, do you typically have a music editor when it comes to game work, or are you doing it all yourself? Or like, yeah, how does that look for you to this day?
It really depends, you know, big productions where my role is a little bit more like on a game like Journey, I have an outsized proportional contribution. I'm the one guy providing music, whereas there might be multiple artists, multiple designers, multiple. So like as a single person contributor, I'm disproportionate. And you know, on other, like on Assassin's Creed, that was a million times more out of proportion because I was still just the one composer, but there was well over 1,000 people on the core development team at Ubisoft versus the 12, I think, on Journey. So like just literally 2 orders of magnitude difference. And so, but that said, on a Ubisoft title, there's a whole music department where music editorial is happening internally by somebody who's either labeled as a music editor, or in the case of like my work on Syndicate, there was a guy who was, his title was music supervisor, which means a different thing than we say music supervisor in film. Like his job was not rights and clearances and things like that, that a music supervisor would have in film. His job was principally working with me to design the setup in Wise. And then he was the one who had, because I had like security is super strict on a game like that. They definitely wouldn't give me access, even though it was technologically feasible. It was like, no, this all done in our studio in Canada. And so I'm sending files to him. He's the one implementing them, and then doing video captures to send to me where he's, you know, like annotating on screen, like, okay, when the player does this, you'll notice there's a 3-second timeout before the next cue triggers in. And then we debate about that. And again, a lot of shared Google Docs and things to make sure everything we're doing is working together. So, and he definitely, on a game like that, there's so much content that they need. He would do a lot of what a music editor traditionally would do, where, for example, like one very fun example was the whole ending cutscene of Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I wrote a cue. They hadn't animated them yet. Like, it's all performance capture with the actors that was happening as I was recording the score. So I had no clue what these cutscenes were going to look like beyond a written description and maybe some storyboards. So I remember in the particular case of the last, literally the final moment of the game, you've beaten the game and you're getting this cutscene, and it's like this kind of poignant scene where all the good guys are getting ambushed and a lot of them are dying and whatever. I wrote this solo piano, little, very, very delicate piece because we thought it would be a really nice way to bring it home in a sort of tragic way. But then when we saw the footage, like the music is recorded, you know, we went to London, and I'm now back, and it's all been mixed and delivered and accordingly stemmed to high hell because of scenarios like this, where they go, this cue is a lot lower energy than the way the actors performed it in the performance capture and the way that it is now coming together on screen. So we need to find another solution. And Christian, the music supervisor, who's the de facto music editor on the project, found backing up a step, one of the deliverables on that game was I had to write these pub songs that get sung diegetically in the world. So as you complete your missions, you can wander into like piano bars or find street buskers, and they'll sing songs about what you've done. Like imagine, because no one knows who you are within the story. You're this anonymous assassin, and a prominent corrupt industrialist has just been found dead. So some composer decides to write a story about like, hey, this really changed the dynamic of the city. And they're kind of satirizing. It's like a musical equivalent of a New York, like a New Yorker cartoon. So they asked me to write these songs, and they got a bunch of actors to perform them and stuff. So I thought for the soundtrack album, I worked with these lyricist songwriters in Australia called Tripod, who are these absolute genius musicians who I just love writing music with. They're amazing. They're incredible lyricists. They're incredible songwriters and composers, and they're just awesome. So when Ubisoft asked me to write these songs, I said I'd love to write them with these three guys in Australia because they're brilliant, and we were doing another project together. And so for the soundtrack album, because again, we were this close to finishing the game, I thought for the soundtrack album, I'll record, because they're a band, I was like, I'll record them singing these songs as like the album version, even though that's not in the game. And because we'd finished that, they had all these files, including the album. These were purely album cuts. But Christian, trying to find a piece of music that could work for this ending scene, and knowing that the score was written before the scene was conceived, or completed at least, he found the final song as performed by the guys in Australia that's not in the game anywhere. It's supposed to be just for the album. And he just did a little snipping and nipping and tucking and slotted in over the ending of the game. And it was like, it was one of those things where I still to this day get comments from people who are like, man, that song at the end of Syndicate, and that was like solved editorially. That was not my idea. That was Christian's idea. It was not written. It was written to be a thing you discover in the world. And then I put it on the album, that particular performance of it in the album, slightly more upbeat and a slightly little bit brisker pace to it. And it sort of saved the day. So that's how, especially on big titles, there's often even multiple people operating in that role because there's just so many fires to put out. Like I have a lot of friends at Sony who work on the new God of War, Ragnarok, and the previous 2018 God of War, where, Bear writes as many mountains of music as you can conceive of, but the game is just so gigantic that they'll just find scenes and realize, oh, we don't have anything for this. And it's just up to them, like the internal music editorial people, all of whom are pretty much composers in their own right as well, to go and say, okay, if we take this, Hardinger fiddle stem and this other like percussion stem, we can kind of time stretch and make a cool new cue entirely for this one moment, because no one knew this moment would even exist yet when Bear wrote the music like that, especially on games of this colossal scale. That's how it often goes. And wow. I certainly have had my taste of that. I always try to be aggressively involved. Some composers are all too happy to send things over. Like Gustavo was very grateful that he could score this his preferred way, which was basically, get inspired by Neil Druckmann and Naughty Dog, come up with a bunch of music together, develop themes, and then here you go, have a nice life. I'm oversimplifying, obviously, and I don't mean to make him sound uncollaborative, but his whole process is very about like, I want to create music and let you use it. I mean, he won an Oscar for Brokeback Mountain, and famously met Ang Lee for the second time at the Oscars, because his whole process is about creating music and then letting them use it how they see fit, which is totally the opposite of how I was brought up, where, Jerry Goldsmith is like scrutinizing over every frame of the movie. And that to me was what film scoring was. But there's obviously totally other schools of thought and different directors also. Some directors don't want that. They want to have the material to editorially play with. And I remember Desplat once saying that Wes Anderson really loves to manipulate the music in the editorial. So like when Desplat was doing Isle of Dogs or whatever, the stop motion Wes Anderson movie, he said they recorded every single instrument of the orchestra in London individually, so that it was basically stemmed to the max, because they didn't know what Wes Anderson was going to want to do. And wow. He finds it in the edit bay and in the music editorial process. And there's definitely games that are both creatively chosen that way and also just necessary to ship, because it's otherwise impossible to do it all.
That's incredible. I would love to open it up to a couple of audience questions. If anyone has any, please add them to the chat here in Zoom.
Great.
While we wait for that, Austin, I was just curious, like, of all the things you learned over the process of working on Journey, 3+ years, however long you worked on it. What were some takeaways in terms of like music editing and interactivity, like things that you learned from that process that really informed your choices on future projects that were so important as lessons for you?
I think it like I said, it kind of ruined me because it emboldened me. It made me realize that if you're willing to put in a lot of hours just play testing and going through it, you really can get down in there and really make it hopefully a lot more elegant than the sort of industry standards were up to that point. And it was one of those where I basically wasn't told not to do it. So I just, and I was so passionate about the game. Like I just was so in love with what they were making. I was such a fan of that game company that I just really was trying to do right by the game above all. And so yeah, it was one of those where I think it made me realize to just keep always asking, because I think composers are a little bit programmed through education and whatnot to kind of like stay in their lane and kind of just try to hit your mark, as it were, like make your deliverables and don't bottleneck anybody. And I was a little bit of an annoying boat rocker who was like, yeah, but what if we did this and what if we did that? And I discovered, hey, everybody's super passionate about making the game better. So all these requests, even though it might be extra work, they were generally pretty happy to do it because it made the game better. And if it wasn't going to make the game better, they would go, I don't like, what's the net positive of that? Is that really going to help? And then they help me see the light and go, okay, you're right. All right, I'll find like a better hill to die on, basically. So it just, I don't know, I learned a lot about how hard you can push. Obviously, I learned a lot about just the basic techniques of interactive music. Like it was as interactive as Flow was. It was very simple by comparison, and it really kind of opened my eyes that we are barely even infants as an industry still. And it really got me excited about all the technologies and things that are going to embolden us to be more and more and more granular and more flexible and fluid and musical, so that it's not just systems that have music stapled onto them that are dragging the music along with it, but actually feels like alive. And Journey was where I learned essentially everything that I know, or at least it was the first instance where I got a taste. And then obviously as years have gone on, I've been able to work on far more complicated games or games that they just have a lot more balls in the air that you have to think about than just the sort of comparative simplicity of the linear storytelling of Journey. So anyway, I know it's sort of like a very broad and vague answer as opposed to like, oh, there's this one plugin that does this or that, like, because all that stuff comes and goes, so it's always more about the philosophy for me.
Absolutely. We have an audience question from Camille. How in depth is your collaboration generally with sound designers in a game? I guess like how often are you talking with them? How much back and forth is there? How does that usually look?
Generally, it's tons because we obviously we don't want to step on each other, but the goal is we're both creating the audio. We're not separate. Like the player, to the extent that the player is actively separating sound design and music in their mind, probably means we've failed in some way. Like it should just be the game's sound. And like, yes, okay, music is a slightly privileged thing that they might independently like the music and like go seek out a soundtrack album or whatever, but that's not really fundamentally the goal. The goal is to help be the audio, my portion of the audio, and so too the sound designer. And so I would be hard pressed to name a single game where I didn't actively make changes in order to accommodate a sound design moment and vice versa, them changing things in order to accommodate or us co-designing things or sharing assets. There's been plenty of times where there's like a very subtle quiet cue and maybe I'm using like pads and ambiances to build a foundation, and I'll send those and they'll incorporate those as a sound designer into their environmental ambiances and things so that it's hard to even know where the sound stops and the music starts. And that's a thing that happens all the time. And the only times it doesn't is usually if everybody's like it's late enough in the process that there's not enough time to kind of be that handholdy. And those are the unfortunate like times. Ideally, it's something like with Steve Johnson on Journey, or like Steve Green on Abzu was a dream. He became one of my absolute favorite collaborators of my career. Like I helped hire him. He was finishing school and looking for a job. And Matt had started Giant Squid and said, you know, you obviously got along great with Steve Johnson. Steve had moved to Ecuador and was basically taking a hiatus from the industry, so he was not available to help us on Abzu. So I was like, I guess we better find someone. So I helped Matt develop a sound design test, and he got a bunch of young, like right out of college people to do this test. And Steve Green's really stood out. So he moved to LA, joined the company, and then he and I were like joined at the hip throughout all of Abzu, and then again on the Pathless. And then we're working, he's on Stray Gods because they were like, we need a sound designer and somebody who really understands interactive sound. Who do you recommend? And I was like, fucking Steve Green's the chosen, he's the golden boy. And at some point, Annapurna discovered him, and they use him on literally every game. You know, he keeps getting called in to rescue. Like he did that game 12 Minutes and a bunch of their titles over the years. And so anyway, yeah, Steve, like working closely with a sound designer is crucial and a joy. I love it. It's so, you know, we find ways to help each other.
That's amazing. Question from Pedram. What do you believe is the best DAW for sound design? I would add to that for you for music composition on recording in the game industry. Like, do you have a preference of DAW?
No, it doesn't matter. I use Digital Performer and Pro Tools, but I'm of the mind that it doesn't matter. If you know how to use all of its features and you're not fighting it, then that's enough.
Question from Trinity. This is a big one. What advice would you give to someone wanting to enter the gaming industry when it comes to music composition? I would add to that music editorial, if you're to be a music editor as well.
I mean, as I told, my story is one of dumb luck. I happened to talk to a guy at a concert and it changed my life. So like my advice, the only way to repeat my advice is to go back in time and be me. And so it's fairly useless. However, the takeaway from that story is I saw a guy who was interesting and I went and talked to him. And it's, in hindsight, I've come to realize I have a natural curiosity about people. And that has led to many conversations. It has led to many late nights, you know, at like GDC at the hotel bar, just wanting to know more about somebody. It has led to game designer friends showing their prototypes and wanting to learn more about it. I think if you go through life with an open-minded way of being, open and actually like use your eyes, look around. I got rid of my car, for example, and I bike to my studio now. It's 2.5 miles from North Hollywood to Burbank, where I ride my bike and I use Uber for everything else. I'll probably get a car again because admittedly I don't love riding in Ubers, but the pace difference of riding a bike, you see things that you've driven past 50 times that you didn't know were there. The number of restaurants, the number of stores, and the number of beautiful murals on the side of buildings that I was clueless about. It's tied into the same philosophy. If you go through life and just open your eyes and try to like expand your aperture a bit, then you'll realize that there's opportunities at minimum for future friendships, but maybe for professionally consequential relationships as well, kind of dotted everywhere. And so that's been the story of my whole career. I've gotten very, very few jobs through the like meat grinder of apply or you know, like I remember, for example, my current agent, Richard Kraft, was a teacher of the composition program at USC when I was there. And I remember at the time, Hollywood Reporter would, like the dailies they used to have, I don't even know if they still do this, but there would be like the 10-page daily Hollywood Reporters separate from the weekly or monthly ones. And they would have production charts in there of like, here's all the movies that have had recently optioned scripts. Here's all the movies that are currently in, you know, pre-production, post-production, etc., just as like a grid. And it was always the production company name and the like general phone number for it. And I remember Richard goes, as a parting comment to us on our last day of his class, this is an agent who represented Jerry Goldsmith and Danny Elfman and John Powell and Desplat and like A-list agent. And so for all of us kids in his class, he makes this proposal where he says, if you cold call 100 productions over the next year or 6 months or whatever, I'll take a meeting with you. He goes, I don't care if you get a single job, but if you just can show that you made 100 cold calls and that you're doing something to further your career, I'll happily take a meeting with you and we can brainstorm about how it's going and we can talk about your career, which seemed like the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory golden ticket. It was like, oh my God, an actual meeting with Richard Kraft. Holy shit. So I remember I called like 400 productions. I went absolutely ballistic. I got one job, and it is probably the worst film I've ever scored ever. And it led to nothing. It led to absolutely zero career opportunities after that. I don't think a single person involved in that film made anything again after that. They went and like got day jobs or something. I don't know. It led to nothing. I had literally 390 plus either no answers or rejections. One exception, I called a guy. First off, if you called people and left a voicemail and said, hey, I'm a composer, call me back if you need something, guaranteed way of never hearing from them again. Because they probably had 10,000 other phone messages the same way. And you're not solving any problems for them now. So I started to get sneaky, and I started to leave voicemails going, I work in post-production, and I've seen your film might have post-production needs. So call me back if I can be of service. That got me 1% more phone calls back. Well, one guy calls me back, and we start talking, and he's like, so where do you work in post-production? I'm like, oh, I'm in music. Oh, really? Sometimes they're like, oh, they realize they've been duped. But this guy, he was really nice. And we ended up talking on the phone for like 2 hours. And he was a director. His was one of, like, sometimes they're calling movies that you have no business calling, like they have big movie stars and whatever. But a lot of them were, I tried to find ones that strategically were at least viable for a 22-year-old who had no credits. And so this guy, he was making a little low budget independent horror film. He calls me back. His name's Damon Osteen. He will forever be someone I am lifelong grateful to, because we ended up having this absolutely fabulous conversation. He's one of those directors who's really, really nerdy for scores. He's got a huge soundtrack collection. He loves the music process of making his movies and this and that. So we talked for like 2 hours. Finally, at the end of the conversation, he goes, look, I got to level with you. 2 weeks ago, I hired a composer on my film. And he goes, I wish we had connected earlier. He goes, he's great. I'm not regretful of hiring him. I'm sure the score is going to be great. We haven't even started yet. So it's not like I'm going to fire him just to work with you, but I just want you to know, I have loved getting to know you, and hopefully someday we can make something together. And I'm like, dude, don't even sweat it. This call was so much fun, just nerding out with somebody who obviously likes all the same stuff. And we just had so much fun talking. I said, honestly, I actually knew who he had hired. I knew like when he told me who it was someone I was familiar with. And I was like, oh, he's going to do awesome. Like, email me when you're having your premiere. If you're just like at a festival or something, I'd love to come, or like keep me in the loop, but just count me a fan. And it was all just this, like, I'm not here to network. I just want to get to know you. Again, it's the same idea. Go through life open and recognize that sometimes you find a thing that's just a fun dude. And that's all I got. It was great. Well, 6 months later, maybe not even 6 months, I get a cold call from someone I've never heard of. And he goes, hey, my name's Alex. I'm making a romantic comedy. My buddy recommended you for my film. We've been having a hard time getting the music sorted out. I've already hired and fired like 3 other composers. And my buddy said, I should call you. And I was like, who's your buddy? And he says, it's Damon Osteen. And it takes me a second to even know who that is, because we spoke on the phone once. I never even met him in person, but he recommended me to this buddy of his who was in need. And so he shows me his romantic comedy. I thought it was brilliant. I thought it was absolutely, I was like, this is one of the best romantic comedies I've ever seen, like of any budget level. And it was micro little. And so I scored it, I went way over, like they had like $1,000. I went way over that hiring musicians and did this little film, and it turned out great. And then flash forward a year later, we finished the film. It premiered at Newport Beach Festival, went great. They sold it to some distributor to release on DVD. And they said, we want to record a DVD commentary track. Well, no one associated with this film had any money. The whole movie was made for sub $50,000. So it was like micro indie, but I had never done a comedy. I'd only done like thrillers and horrors and dramas. So I was stoked. Plus it's really good. The actors are all great. Story is actually very clever. It's like the main character plays like an aspiring director. So it's like full of very like love of cinema kind of winks and nods and stuff. And I just loved the movie. I still love it. It was called Knuckle Draggers at the time, because it was all about like the stupid savagery of men on the dating scene. But they changed it to the Alpha Male Experiment, which I always hated that name, but the movie's excellent. And so they go, we want to record a DVD commentary track, and we literally can't afford to book like a transported, studio. So he goes, does your studio work? And I was like, I own a Rode NT2. We can all huddle around. And I had two headphone inputs. So it was going to be the two main actors, one of whom was also the main producer, and the director. So the director goes, I go, I don't have headphones for you. And he goes, I know the movie so well, I don't even need them. It's fine. So they recorded a commentary track where two of them are in headphones, and then the director has to just watch the screen, and they're all huddled around the mic in my tiny little studio. And I just sat on the couch. So the reason I tell all this story was because the main actor, I had never met before, but he was like he was a steadily working actor who was reasonably well known. He had gotten his break as one of the Band of Brothers soldiers, actors. And I was a huge fan. And am a huge fan of Band of Brothers. And so I was like, oh, this is worth it just to meet this guy, because that's cool. And so he comes over to the studio, and then we all go out and have dinner afterward. And we're just getting to know each other. And he's asking me about my stuff. And I had done a couple little movies that actually had little modest soundtrack albums. So I said, hey, I'll give you a soundtrack if you like. So 6 months later or whatever, I get a phone call from him who goes, I hope you don't mind, I gave your CDs to a friend of mine. He's another actor from Band of Brothers. He's making a movie. He needs music. That actor was Frank John Hughes, with he and Rick Gomez, who were both Band of Brothers actors, had now written and produced and were acting in a movie of theirs. And that began this domino effect where at this point, I think I've worked with every single fucking one of those Band of Brothers actors, because once they all started to hit about 40, they all started to want to write and direct and produce and not just act. And so this one phone call with this guy who didn't hire me led to working on a tiny little movie that then led to, and these are also some of my real close friends now, like Ross. Just last year, Ross, this lead actor from the Little Romantic Comedy who got this whole ball rolling for me, he finally sat in the director's chair for the first time just a year ago, and they shot a movie in the pandemic, and he reached out to me to score his directorial feature, this great prison drama called A Violent Man. And so it's like all these relationships, including really close friendships. Like Frank John Hughes is a guy I would kill for. I mean, he is just a great guy. It just led to so much, and it was all because I didn't check out of the call. I didn't check out of the conversation when I realized there was no work opportunity for me. So right. I know the question like 6 hours ago was, how does one build a career? This is what's been my strategy. I just meet people. I recognize that I don't control the timeline. Notice how many of these stories are like, then a year later, something happened. And bear in mind, there's 50 other people I met in the meantime where nothing happened, where we were just friends, or we weren't even friends. We met, it was cool, and then nothing. I mean, I did this game called Erica, for example, a few years ago. That's like this F&B game, super, super awesome. The way I got that game was because I once went to London to do a concert with Video Games Live and conduct Journey. And there was a girl who tagged herself on Twitter, who tagged me on her like selfie on Twitter to say, I'm going to the concert and I'm in uniform or whatever, because she had like a Journey scarf that she was going to wear to the show. And she tagged me to be like, I'm so excited that you're in London. So I DM her and I go, can I meet you before and borrow your scarf to wear while I conduct? Because I thought that would be cool to like have it in my jacket and then dramatically reveal it on stage and put it on and then conduct the orchestra. And so she's like, sure. So then we just stayed in touch and became friends. Well, she, as it turns out, I didn't even know this, she was friendly with like random game people in the London scene. So one day I'm at GDC, she sends me a message and she goes, I have a friend who's at the bar at the W Hotel right now. Go meet him. He's got a thing you'll think is cool. And this guy showed me his prototype to Erica before he made a deal with Sony. He signed me on as the composer before he even had a publisher on that game, because he showed me on an iPad what he was doing with FMV, and it blew my mind. I was like, holy crap, no one's tried this since the 90s with bad CD-ROM games, and you've cracked the code. You actually made this a viable genre. This was because I made a friend, this wonderful woman, Priscilla, in London, who she was essentially like a fan. I don't like that term because it feels too sycophanty. She was a glorious, wonderful soul of a gracious Journey supporter. And it led to a relationship with that company. and obviously another opportunity to work with Sony, and a game that's wildly unlike any other game I've done. And so, again, it's just like, I just like meeting people, and obviously it helps to, like go to a GDC, go to a Game Sound Con, go to places where you're likely to meet people. You're not just meeting random people, but there's like, you're filtering somewhat for the right industry. But even then,
Yeah.
like, I got a game off of a girl who showed up at a concert, as it were, like, and she's still a friend, So,
That's
all
incredible.
right, let me try
And
to lightning round some of these others here, because I'm
yeah,
too
yeah, yeah.
talkative, and I got
So
I'm
inspiring.
starving. So,
So inspiring, though. So, okay, yeah. So Kenneth had a couple of questions we can fire through.
yeah.
What piece of information inspires you the most as a composer? And then he kind of, I think, jumping forward in that question in his comment,
Mm.
is there a specific question you usually ask a director or developer in order to engage and to ensure you're generating the right message through your music?
It's a really good, very savvy question. And the question, to quote there's a game designer friend of mine who always says, what is the story we're trying to tell? Anytime you hit a roadblock with design, sound, music, whatever, and you don't really know what you're doing, it's always just like, wait, what is the story I'm trying to tell? Once you can answer that, everything else tends to click into place. And it's the same with music. So I'm always asking them questions like, what kind of game is this, though? Like, yes, okay, you run and jump, or you duck and cover and shoot, or you walk through a desert landscape towards a mountain. But what are we saying with this? What is your actual takeaway? I sometimes will phrase it as, if you could write your absolute fantasy perfect IGN review, what would their summary of the game be? And they're like, oh, I want them to realize that this is not a game about walking to a mountain. This is a game about life and a game about love. And I'm like, great. That's what the score is going to be about. And often that includes, what source material are you drawing from? Like, what literature, or what, because if all we're doing is pointing at other games and going, oh, well, we really like how this game did it. It's usually surface level. Maybe not, but often, like Aliens Fire Team Elite. It's like, okay, what is this fundamentally about? What is this? Like, this is not a horror game the way that the franchise, like Alien, is a horror game. This is fundamentally an action game, but this is also a co-op game. So how do we make sure that this is reconciled with the fact that on some fundamental level, this is about having fun with your friends? This is meant to be communal. How do I, if nothing else, make sure I'm never in the way of that? It's always just like, dig down to the bedrock. And it's so often, especially in very narrative things, there's just one of a handful of archetypes, like, oh, this is a love story, or this is a story about learning to let go, or this is a story about grief, or this is a story about a boy and his dog, or this is like, so often you can get it down to something that simple. And then you go, okay, now let's build from there.
Yeah. I want to jump ahead. Brendan had a question. What are your thoughts on generative music systems such as UE5 Quartz? Do you feel like there's potential to explore the unique combinations with stemmed cues?
All I'll say, due to NDAs that I'm under, is it's very, very exciting.
Love it. Josh had a question in terms of writing interactive music. How would you go about starting this process? What game or concept art indicate what should be played at what point? And would these tracks be written with the idea in mind that certain stems could potentially be faded in or out? You kind of touched on a little bit of this, but if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things sound really awesome on paper. And with games, the thing that, like, all game designers and game developers worth their salt realize that you must have people play test it in order to know if it's going to do the thing that you think it is, and if the player is going to have the correct, like, the desired emotional outcome, and whatever narrative they're supposed to be absorbing, all that kind of stuff. And it's the same with designing these interactive music systems. I can have a developer tell me, oh, we're going to do this and this and this and this, and I could dream up the most elaborate thing in the world, and then when you sit down and play the game and you realize, oh, well, in practice, it's never going to behave the way that it needs to for that system to be the ideal one. As much as on a wide erase board it looks like we've just designed the Notre Dame, if the player is just simply not going to experience that, then it's pointless. And so it's very often about, okay, what's the simplest possible thing to just get something in there and then pick up a controller or sit at your keyboard and mouse or put on your Oculus or whatever, and then get in there and just see what's it like. And more importantly, watch other people who are not you do it and see what that yields. And then iterate, refine. It is one of those, not once have I ever like divined some perfect system as if, oh, I know exactly what to do, because that's ludicrous. No game is made that way. That's just not, games are so much about this conversation with the playtesting to find like, oh, this is the optimal way to do it if we want this outcome, because players are consistently doing this. And the great thing is, really great developers will develop a lot of playtest and like QA supportive tools to really help this, so that it's not just you anecdotally watching somebody, but like they create heat maps where you can see, okay, if the player is like on the Pathless, for example, it's a big open world island environment. Well, every single time they had a playtester, it would track, we could zoom all the way out, and we could see like in this global kind of map that their route, and see how lost or not they were, and how they wound and weaved through the environment. And when there are certain like environmental triggers that change how the music is going to behave, I could see, oh, like I thought it would be really cool if the music changes when you cross this river. Well, players went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth like 20 times. Well, that made the music constantly whip back and forth and then like crash, because it's not supposed to do that. And it's like, okay, well, clearly that's not a boundary we should be doing, because they're constantly seeing like a thing that they want to go to over there. So maybe the music should follow a different route, that kind of stuff. You just don't know. And you always play the game differently than someone who doesn't know what the game is. So it's, it's always about the play test.
Question from Pedram. Have you ever thought about of how you'd possibly continue an already perfect experience like Journey if there ever comes a sequel, especially after revisiting it for the Traveler Symphony?
Well, the whole Traveler Symphony thing was just my way of saying thank you to all the people who had been so supportive of Journey for the last 10 years. And it was obviously purely just it was a record. It was an album. It was partially just bucket list. Like, I get to work with the London Symphony. That alone I'm happy with, and over the moon about. And but also bear in mind that I in no way would ever consider anything I've ever done, including Journey, to be perfect. So a sequel often is exciting because you go, I can finally like find ways to make it better. But that said, I've most of the only sequels I've really worked on in that sense were the Banner Saga franchise, like sequels of my own work. I mean, like I've joined franchises like Assassin's Creed and whatnot, where I'm stepping in before, like after other composers have come before me. But Banner Saga was one where I actually got to do the whole franchise start to finish, and it never felt like, oh, the first one was perfect, where do we go? It was like the story progresses, so how do I make the music progress? Like, what did I not do within this palette and the kind of parameters that I created? And it was a blast. I mean, it was a little intimidating at the start of each game because it did feel like, Jesus, I didn't leave anything on the table. I don't know if I have any more ideas. But then 2 seconds into it, you start seeing all the cool new things they're doing in the game and the place the story goes, and then ideas tend to follow. So yeah, long and short of it, things are never perfect. So
I want to close with I want to close with this, Austin. Sound editors and I imagine music editors don't often get much feedback from fans on how their work has impacted their lives. But I imagine this game must have impacted you, and you've gotten so much feedback from people around the world for over 10 years now. What is some of the most memorable feedback you've gotten from someone who's played the game, experienced your music in the 10 plus years since it's come out?
I don't even know how to answer that. I mean, people have sent some of the most profound. Journey is a unique game because it's so emotional and it's so minimal that I didn't even anticipate this. It didn't even occur to me that this would happen, but it happened a lot once it came out, where all the barren nature of the art direction and the fact that there's no dialogue or text of any kind, there's not even UI. Players would project in a very Rorschach test kind of way not just their interpretation, but like their emotional needs. You know, people, the game became a proxy for saying goodbye to dead family members or or like this game helped me through a breakup, or this game made me think about my place in the world. And like people started having these intense, very, very, very personal reactions to it, where, and then again, because music has this very unique place within all the various disciplines that create a game, like an animator or a programmer, they don't get an equivalent of a soundtrack album. So we're just like lucky that we have this thing that you can put out in the world where someone can sit on a bus or on a plane or whatever, anywhere in their life, even just falling asleep in bed at night, and listen to the music, and all the things that the game brought to their life will come flooding back through the music. Even if it's a terrible score, if they have an emotional attachment to the game, the music's going to be bound up with that. So composers are in this very lucky position that's just like a weird byproduct of the novelties of this particular discipline. And so the result is that I've gotten a lot of those emails from people because the music makes them think about things that really the game is what made them think about it. But because they were able to sit there and listen to the soundtrack 50,000 times after they finished the game, it's like all the processing of what the game unlocked for them happens while they're with the album. It's my way of saying I don't take credit for the kinds of reactions that people got from playing the game. Like I'm very grateful when, especially like when young composers message me and want to study the music. I get a lot of people asking for the sheet music and things and like trying to learn from it and whatever. And that's incredibly touching. But when people kind of use it as their proxy to talk about what the game did for them, I mean, I've just gotten really, really intense and personal messages from people that are like, I was an engineer and then I went and picked up a cello and it's like, I'm happy for the first time. Like I started learning music, or I want to join the game industry now off of this, or what, like people change their whole life. And it's just been crazy. And I mean, they still come. I still get these messages. And 10 years later, when most times it's like, new things come out and there's new things that people are excited about. And so even if it had been just that little first 6 months or something, it would have been already life-changing. But the fact that it's still a thing, and it's still like I was in Milan in Italy, people just coming up to me in the middle of this Comic-Con type environment with a copy of the game. It's like they saw online I would be there, and they just show up and they're like, hey, can you sign this or whatever? It's surreal. It never stops being old. I mean, the grand sort of example of this, I guess, was my girlfriend did a Journey cosplay in Egypt, like took these unbelievable photos out in sand dunes, and it like went viral online, and Sony or somebody tagged me on Twitter, and it like started this friendship that later, and now we live together. Like it like, wow. So like it changed my life, and obviously if she hadn't been aware of the game, she would have never made this cosplay. And it was like the artistry of what she did was unbelievable. Then I discovered she's a painter, and we started collaborating and we would do improvised performances together where she would paint, I'd play piano, and like it led to this whole thing that over the course of several years, like obviously very deeply changed my life in pretty seismic ways. And so like, I guess if we're asking about reactions to the game, that's probably, I guess that's the one that's affected me the most. But even just these, emails or tweets or Instagram, like sometimes I'll look and I'll see that, like Instagram has, like it tries to filter what it thinks is spam. And every now and again, I'll go poking in there, and yeah, most of it's spam, but every now and again, I'll find someone who's just like, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but like Journey, and sometimes it's like, it's so intense, like I didn't kill myself because of this game or something, where like, and my life would be a lot more efficient if I didn't feel compelled to write back to every single one of those messages when I find them. But I don't see how it could ever, I never want to be someone who takes that stuff for granted, because it's, it's so lucky to work. It's so lucky to work as a composer, period. And it's lucky to be able to work in an industry as powerful as games. But it's something beyond luck to work on to have had the luck to work on a thing like Journey, particularly. That's why 10 years later, I'm still all too happy to do a Saturday night MSPE event talking about it, because some people have friends that are like, aren't you sick of talking about Journey by now? And I'm like, I have composer friends that are by all measures very successful, maybe by many metrics more successful than me. And yet they've never had something like this. They've never had a game where people, send them tearful emails or whatever. And it's like you've had an opportunity to play a role in someone's life in a way that you obviously had no awareness of or control over. But like, there's a lot of things that are not worth that in my, you could throw all the awards or money or whatever, and to have the luck of being able to say, yeah, I worked on this game that really meant that to those people. I'll never take it for granted. I'll never feel like, another chance to talk about the game. I mean, hopefully it's been very obvious the last 2 hours. Like I feel so lucky, and it's a passionate subject for me, and not from a self-aggrandizing standpoint. Like I said, there's a million things I wish I could improve about the game. I'm just lucky to be part of something that was so novel and oddly powerful.
Incredible. I mean, it's clearly such a resonant work, a soundtrack that you did, and on such an important game at an important time, I think, in the games industry. I'm really appreciate you taking the time to talk about all this tonight, Austin. And
Oh, it's my pleasure, man.
I also just want to say, just having known you for so long, I mean, it's incredible to see your career before that point, after that point, what that game did. It's really amazing.
It's a pleasure, man. It's a real I love sharing the long haul with folks, and you're one of those. I mean, I was at your wedding, like
Yeah.
Like I don't take that stuff for granted, so I'm thrilled to do this with you. I appreciate the ask, and we'll find excuse to do it again.
Thank you so much. Well, I appreciate it, Austin. Thank you so much for your time and all your stories and inspiring. Just talk about your work on this project and everything else.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to this MPSE Sound Advice event. Please stay tuned to our MPSE Facebook page and emails, and hope to see you at the next event. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.